multiplied reasons for why we don't have one this morning, but I'll try to call them out so that you can follow through. But the main idea, I think, of this passage is that the obedience of faith brings blessing to the faithful and a testimony to the world. So the obedience of faith brings blessing to the faithful and is a testimony to the world. In chapter 26, verses 1 through 6, the first thing that we're going to see is these blessings come through the obedience of faith. So there's this tie between faith and blessing. The second thing that we're going to see is a repeat, right? We've seen this before, and that's in verses 7 through 11, where we have this concept of fear inhibiting the obedience of faith. And then in verses 12 through 22, we'll see that the obedience of faith at times will invite opposition or oppression. And then finally, in 23 through 33, the obedience of faith will be a testimony to the world. So let's work through this first idea. Blessings come through the obedience of faith. So verse 1 sets us up for today's story. We've already discussed that there's significant overlap between Abraham's interaction with Abimelech and Isaac's interaction with him as well. There's between those two stories. But the narrator sets up the story in verse 1 by distinguishing these events from Abraham's experience, just in case we might be tempted to think that this is the same story just repeated over again. He says, "Now there was a famine in the land, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines." Now, I'm not sure exactly how much time has elapsed since Abraham left Canaan and went to Egypt during the time of that famine, or the time that he was in Gerar, with Abimelech. Of course, Isaac had not been born yet when Abraham was in either place, and so, again, as I mentioned, I don't think the story is in chronological order with the rest of the story from, Jacob and Esau, and so it doesn't seem like they've been born yet. So there could be anywhere from 60 to 70 years between the events, between Abraham going down to Egypt, Abraham's interaction with the first Abimelech, and then Isaac's interaction with this second Abimelech. Again, I'm going to argue that these aren't the same necessarily. Abimelech simply means "my father is king," so it could be just a title for a Philistine king, just like the title of Pharaoh is used in Egypt to represent different pharaohs. So I think we're safe to assume that this present king knew of Abraham, and he knew of Isaac. Abraham had become such a presence in Canaan, in Gerar particularly, that the previous Abimelech, and the treaty that he had with him, that would have been known to this next Abimelech. But anyway, we've got a famine that forces Isaac to move his household to Gerar. And so it is here in this move that Isaac receives this confirmation of blessing and promises that were given to his father. They are his as well. And so there's this expectation, though, of obedience that are tied to these promises, just like there was with Abraham. But there's a nuance. There's a little bit of a difference between the promise that the Lord gave to Abraham and the promise that he gives to Isaac here. And the nuance that the Lord adds is that God promises his presence for those who obey. This is what you see in verses 2 and 3. Okay, so blessings come through obedience of faith, but one of the blessings is that he promises his presence for those who obey. Look at verses 2 and 3. "And the Lord appeared to him and said, 'Do not go down to Egypt, dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and will bless you. For to you and your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father.'" So again, this scenario kind of mirrors chapter 12 in Abraham's experience when he was told to leave his country, go to the land of Canaan, to go to a land that I'm going to show you. Except that Isaac is not commanded to leave, he's commanded to stay. And you have this command to not go into the land of Egypt. So maybe he can move around to the land, but he's not to leave. Essentially, what this command does is it tells Isaac to stay in the land and trust God through this famine. Okay, so we've got this famine that's present. He's got to trust God and stay in this place. Stay in the place where the famine is happening. And so, verse 3 contains the nuance. Sojourn in the land, and I will be with you. God promises his presence. That's different than all of the promises that God had made to Abraham. God was with Abraham, but here the promise of God's presence is explicit. I will be with you. I will bless you. And the rest of verse 3 is pretty familiar to us in that God promises to give Isaac and his offspring the land that he swore an oath to give to Abraham. But in verses 4 through 6, the covenant is reiterated in the same terms as it was given to Abraham. And here we find another thing, is that obedience brings God's blessings. So in verse 4, we have the same terms. You've got multiplied offspring as the stars of heaven. You've got the land promise. We've got blessing to all the nations through Isaac's offspring. But notice the basis of this covenant action in verse 5. Here's the reason. So we got all these promises. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Now that's interesting. Each one of those terms is associated with the law of Moses. We got no record of Abraham receiving any sort of law, like a written code. And here it's explained: charges, commandments, statutes, and laws. So we might ask, how did Abraham know what all of these things were? How did he know what the law of God was? Did he have a copy of it? I think one commentator, and I think this is probably the best answer, he suggests that the law was written on Abraham's heart, just like it says in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 through 14, where it says, "For this commandment that I command you today," the law, this is Moses speaking, right, to Israel right before they go into the promised land, "it's not too hard for you, neither is it far off. It's not in heaven that you should say, 'Who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it down to us, that we may hear and do it?' Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, 'Who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it?' But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so that you can do it." Abraham is a man of faith who could be described as one who kept the law. That law seems to be in his heart. Paul seems to make this connection in Romans chapter 10, verse 8, when he writes that the word which Moses said was in your heart. Right? And Paul says that's the word of faith that we're proclaiming. Let me read Romans 10:8 for you. What does it say? The word is near you and in your mouth and in your heart. He's summarizing what Moses has said, and then he says that he explains it. That is the word of faith that we proclaim to you. And so I think that is right. Abraham had the law of God written on his heart, and by means of faith, Abraham obeyed that law. You know, when Moses was writing this to the original audience, I think the point that he's trying to drive home here is that Israel has to respond to the promises of God with obedience, just like Abraham did, just like Isaac did. Abraham and Isaac are being held up as those who responded well to the promises of God, and they've done so with obedience. Thus, they receive the promises. I think the promises of God come to us in the same way. Blessings come through obedience of faith, through the obedience of faith. Now, I'm phrasing it that way, and kind of all of my main points are worded this way with this phrase, obedience of faith. And I'm doing that because that's the way Paul talks about it specifically in Romans 1:5. He also mentions it in 16:26. So just hang with me just for a sec, and I'll tie this back into Genesis 26. So let me just talk a little bit about Romans 1:5. So Again, in Romans, Paul opens up in his usual fashion. He's speaking about his apostleship. It's for the sake of the gospel that comes through Jesus Christ. All right, and then in Romans 1, verses 5 and 6, he says, through whom, okay, so that's Jesus Christ. Through Jesus, we receive grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all the nations, including you who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. Now, what we have not talked a lot about in Genesis, though it's been under the surface the whole time, is the grace of God in giving Abraham these blessed promises and the faith to believe in them, the faith to believe God. This is all grace. Abraham did nothing to earn God's favor. God granted to him all of these precious promises by grace alone. But grace, especially in the way that Paul talks about it in Romans 1:5, grace can be thought of in a couple ways. It takes two forms in salvation. Again, I think this is true for Abraham. It's true for us. It's the same thing that Paul is talking about as well. There is this grace that brings the obedience of faith in terms of our response to the gospel. So that is, like, faith is the content of obedience. Now, when someone says that they have a ring of gold, right? Gold is the content that makes up that ring. So when we hear the gospel and we respond to it, that response, that faith response to the gospel, is an obedient response to the gospel. You hear the gospel, you respond to it in faith. That's faith of obedience. But in that case, faith is the content of that obedience. It's what it is. But there is also an obedience that is produced by faith, by a faith that we already possess. Okay, so let's illustrate that by saying the phrase, an act of courage. Okay? Courage is what a person already possesses that enables them to do certain acts. So in this way, a person that possesses faith or does the obedience of faith, they're actually doing acts of obedience because they possess the faith already. And I think that is the sense of obedience of faith that Paul's communicating in Romans 1:5. He's been given grace and an apostleship to bring about acts of obedience in those who have faith in the Lord Jesus. And again, that's what is the basis for what Moses writes in Genesis 26:6. Because of the grace of saving faith that God has given Abraham, Abraham is enabled by that grace to live out his faith. He lives it out in obedience to the law that's written on his heart. And so it's on the basis of his faith, the faith that God has given him, demonstrated by the acts of obedience, that Abraham was blessed with great and precious promises. So what I'm trying to do here is just give us all a clear sense that Abraham did not receive the promises solely because he was obedient. It's not as if he worked and earned those promises. He was given faith by grace. His faith is worked out in his act of obedience, and the promises are secured in that way. So it's all God doing all of everything so that he receives the highest glory. And so that's why I've included in all four of our main points this morning this concept of the obedience of faith. I want us to see that our faith is worked out as Isaac, as Abraham have given us an example. Our faith is also worked out through acts of obedience. Verse 6 confirms that Isaac possesses the faith that Abraham had. And that is expressed in obedience, right? Verse 6, so Isaac settled in Gerar. Given the command, He does it. Simple as that. That's the obedience of faith present in Isaac. His faith in God is working itself out in obedience, but like his father, Isaac is not perfect. Abraham and Isaac might be models of faith, but they're not the Savior. They're not the Messiah. They're fallible humans, and that's what we see next in Isaac. Just like his father had to learn, Isaac, along with each one of us, must see that fear inhibits the obedience of faith. That's our second main idea for this morning. Fear inhibits the obedience of faith. So Isaac succumbs to the same temptation brought on by fear that his father succumbed to. He was afraid for his life in the presence of the Philistines because his wife was beautiful. He thought the Philistines would kill him to get her. Again, the same mindset, same thought process that Abraham had. But here's the same lesson. Weak faith jeopardizes that blessing. Just like we learned with Abraham, this scheme is hatched in a faithlessness, a state of faithlessness. It places the promise of offspring in jeopardy because of the risk of Rebekah being taken by someone else as a wife. Again, I think this is super important because if we're not going chronologically, they don't have any children yet. This is a different situation than both of the sister-wife lies that Abraham used, in that Isaac's wife wasn't actually taken into the royal harem. And also in this circumstance, God did not intervene in a miraculous way in the way that he did in Egypt and with the first Abimelech. He didn't act miraculously to preserve the marriage and preserve his promises. In this case, God just uses the ordinary means, ordinary human interaction to preserve this marriage. And the ordinary means that he uses Abimelech observing Isaac and Rebekah interacting in a way that suggests they are not brother and sister. And in the discovery of their lie, we find that weak faith is subject to rebuke. Again, we saw this in the life of Abraham. We see it again here in Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah are exposed. In verse 8 it says, when he had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out of a window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. So Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Behold, she's your wife. How then could you say she's my sister?" Isaac said to him, "Because I thought lest I die because of her." So Abimelech sees Isaac and Rebekah laughing. This is not as if Isaac just told Rebekah a joke and they're like yucking it up. They're just enjoying a good laugh together. Again, I can't bring out all the Hebrew all the time, but this is a play on words. So if we were reading this in Hebrew, we would see that laughing is a similar word to Isaac's name, because Isaac's name means laughter. So throughout Hebrews, and anytime you see the laughter, there's a subtle little hint that ties it back to Isaac and who it was. So sometimes Hebrew scholars will say that you can literally say Isaac was Isaacing with Rebekah, whatever that means. Whatever they were doing, it was not appropriate for brothers and sisters. And so Abimelech calls them on it. And here again we see that the pagans have a high sense of decency. They have a high view of the sanctity of marriage. And Abimelech is outraged that Isaac would put his people, put his nation in a position to do something egregious that would invite harm to them and bring guilt upon them. So the king actually issues an order of protection on them. You know, again, we're not casting stones at Isaac because we all act in faithless ways, but we understand that Isaac did not have to operate in this way. He knows God's power. I mean, he was delivered from just about being skewered, right, by the miraculous hand of God. But he failed in this regard, and he received a just rebuke. You know, we probably know that most of what we worry about never really happens. A lot of times our fear is unfounded. But thankfully, God's promises are not based on our merit. God is faithful even when we're not. And so here's another reminder that the covenant relationship with God is not based on the inherent goodness of the human partner. No one deserves God's grace and favor. But here he is giving it. The story, however, moves on quickly from this incident. In verses 12 through 22, we see that the obedience of faith invites opposition. So God makes good on his promise. All right, we're not surprised there. Isaac's faith is well-founded. And here we see in 12 through 15, God blesses the faithful. Verse 12, we find out that during a regional famine, I don't know how widespread this famine was, but during this regional famine, Isaac harvests a bumper crop, 100-fold harvest. And not only that, verse 13 tells us that he has amassed tremendous wealth. And I think maybe here's where we need to be careful about how we understand what's happening. So we might be tempted to think that if we're obedient to God, if we're exercising the obedience of faith, then we'll get wealthy too. I think we're smart enough not to fall into that trap. But here's where we go back to Romans 1:5. You remember how Paul said that he received grace and an apostleship? What he's highlighting is the fact that he received a special commission as an apostle. And not everyone receives that. I think the same is true with Isaac. The position that Isaac received on the account of God's promises required him to be wealthy. That was the role that he was given. Not everyone is given that same role, thus not everyone, and we could probably say the majority of believers, will not receive great amounts of wealth. But what that does mean is that God gives grace to do whatever role that he's given to you. So if you take out Paul's word apostleship, he says, I received grace and an apostleship. And you take out, if we're thinking about Isaac, you take out, Isaac, God gave grace and lots of wealth to Isaac. If you take those things out, and now you say that I have received grace and what? Fill in the blank. Grace and motherhood, grace and fatherhood, grace and to be an electrician, grace to be a secretary, grace and the office, the position of an office administrator, grace and the office of a pastor, grace and the ability to be a teacher, grace and the ability to drive truck. Whatever it is that God has called you to do. In that role, as a new covenant partner, God blesses you with the grace to do whatever it is that he's called you to do in whatever situation in life that you might find yourself in. It's going to be different for each one of us. But as we live in our own station of life, it's inevitable that worldly people will see God's blessing on us if we're living the life of the obedience of faith. People will see God's blessing on us. And in that case, we might experience opposition. And that's what you see in verses 16 through 22. Worldly people will oppose the faithful. Worldly people will oppose the faithful. Maybe believers will find that there are those that see the blessing of God on us and don't care much for it. So I think it's interesting that the Philistines did not take kindly to the blessing of God on Isaac. Isaac's blessing was perceived as a threat to them, and that threat led them to envy, and the Philistines envied Isaac in such a way that they began to do things to oppose him. They began to make life difficult for him. They began to fill up his wells. And they do this until Abimelech actually runs Isaac out of the area. He says, "You're too wealthy, you're too powerful now. Please leave." So, Isaac and company, they make a series of moves until they find a place where they can live without conflicting with the resident Philistines. Now, Isaac is portrayed as one who is less inclined to engage in conflict, even though I think he does have a right to those wells. And that right is based on the treaty that Abraham had made with the previous Abimelech. Perhaps the Philistines are thinking that Abraham is dead, that treaty is null and void now, and they don't respect it anymore. And so they begin to fight over the wells. And they begin to conflict. And so Isaac actually moves around to avoid the conflict. And I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. Some people, some commentators think that Isaac is displaying a weakness here. He's like avoiding tension at all costs. And they take the full picture of Isaac. He seems to be pretty laid back and not willing to get involved in much and in conflict. And they see this as a weakness, but I don't know whether Isaac is passive or not. It seems like he does have the right focus. In this situation, anyway, he seems to be doing the right things. And what he's doing is he's actually content to allow the Lord to work things out, to bring about the promises, without having to force the situation or use tactics of manipulation. Okay, think back to Abraham and Sarah when they dreamed up the whole Hagar scenario to bring about the promise of God. Isaac seems to be willing to avoid this conflict and move around and allow the Lord to deal with the situation. And so he goes through this series of moves. With each move, a well is dug, and then then it's given a name based on the outcome of the conflict that kind of surrounds that well. The first well, it brings conflict, and its name is Essek. Essek means argument. And so they move on from there. They dig a second well. That well also brings conflict. The Philistines and Isaac's servants fight over that one. And it is named Sitnah, meaning adversary. But then finally, they dig a third well, and that creates enough space between Isaac and the Philistines so that there's no more conflict. And that well is named Rehoboth, meaning to make room. And so then, Isaac acknowledges the Lord's hand, and in his hand in making room for them in this land, and so he names the well accordingly. But in all that Isaac has experienced, in all this adversity, he's finally coming to a place of peace. His life's testimony of the Lord's faithfulness. This is where he's come. His life is a testimony, and it's undeniable even to the Philistines. And I think that it shows us this last idea in verses 22 through 33. The obedience of faith will be a testimony to the world. So now in 23, Isaac's moved into Beersheba. This is the place where the Lord appeared to his father also. So the Lord appears to Isaac as well. But then the story kind of ends with Abimelech seeking Isaac out. And that's something of an ironic twist. The guy that kicked Isaac out of their land is the same guy that wants to be on his team now. And just as long as he's far enough away, right? But the broader point is, I think this shows how much of a testimony Isaac has become to the world around him. And there are several ways in which he displays his testimony. The first is that, and I think that what we see here is the faithful are a testimony through their worship. The Lord appears to Isaac in Beersheba on the night that he moved into that area. And in the second part of verse 24, we read that, fear not, for I am with you. Again, there's that presence of the Lord again. And I will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. Now, this is the third time that we have read that the Lord has blessed Isaac. This is this is the same blessing that is founded on this promise that was given to Abraham. And Isaac, in this blessing, responds appropriately. And he responds by worshiping, by building an altar. Now, I think that the first and primary response of every believer should be worship when you experience the blessing of God. That worship serves as a testimony to the faithfulness of God. And then Isaac does some other things that kind of establishes himself. That this act of worship, in conjunction with two others, established this solid testimony that Isaac believes God and he is planting himself in the land. And one is by setting up his tents there and then digging a well. You get the sense that Isaac has faith in the promises of God. He's being a testimony through worship, through establishing himself, through digging the wells. And that testimony is successful. Because in verses 26 through 31, we see that the world will see the blessing of the faithful. Again, this is kind of an ironic twist, but Abimelech shows up with his chief advisor and the commander of his army. And that might make Isaac a little bit nervous. I think it does when you see his reaction. And after all that Isaac has been through, the Lord still blesses him. The Philistines can see it. And so look what they say in verses 28. In verse 28, he says, we see plainly, that the Lord is with you. So we said, let there be a sworn pact between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have not done to you anything but good, and have sent you away in peace. And then look what they say again. You are now the blessed of the Lord. Twice, Abimelech acknowledges the blessing of God. It's pretty much undeniable. Yeah, and Abimelech's a bit of an opportunist, right? He wants this covenant with Isaac. He knows that, I think his response is actually kind of funny, but he knows that Isaac has had a bit of a rough patch at the hands of his own people. He kind of downplays that part of it, right? He says, "Look, do us no harm, just like we haven't touched you. And we sent you away in peace. Never mind the whole well filling up thing." Probably what Abimelech is referring to is that promise that they made not to harm Rebekah. And so he highlights that part of it. Hey, we kept that part of it. Let's just forget about the wells. But Isaac, I think, is gracious and he obliges. They share this covenant meal together, and they depart with an oath. They depart in peace. Now, I think Isaac could very well have made life difficult for them. I mean, after all, Abimelech and his company have already recognized that Isaac is more powerful than them. But Isaac opts for peace. I think there's a lesson there. The Lord might allow the world to respond positively to the way that he blesses his people. So I think that means when we have the opportunity, when there has been conflict, we have the opportunity to make peace, that's the route we go. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, verse 9, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Why? For they shall be called the sons of God. It's that covenant relationship, right? So there is a blessing on our end, but there also may be a blessing on the other end, in that others will see the Lord. In that same sermon, just in chapter 5, just down a few verses, Jesus says, "In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." When we live with the obedience of faith, our lives become a testimony to the world. They can see the blessing of the Lord on us. Now, I'm not talking about material blessing. Probably what I'm talking about most is that innate joy that we have no matter what circumstance we happen to be in. Something that the world can't touch. That's kind of the light, I think, that the world will see. That joy expressed in our obedience and faith and our good works and the things that we do. And those things reflect glory back up to God when unbelievers see them. Sometimes they'll respond poorly, but sometimes, like Abimelech, people will acknowledge that we are the blessed of the Lord. And maybe the Lord will use our lives in the way that we live and also in the words that we say to bring others to faith in Him. And then finally, as we wrap up this section in verses 32 and 33, we see that the Lord's blessings never cease. The Lord's not done blessing Isaac yet. He receives one more confirmation of the Lord's blessing. That same day that the peace treaty was made, as soon as they leave, Isaac's servants find another well. Another sign of blessing that God is going to sustain them in the land. Again, remember, they have to have these wells in order to survive. They need water. They need water for themselves. They need water for their flocks, especially as large as the flocks are becoming. So the fact that they find this another well is yet another blessing from the Lord that He's going to sustain them. Now, don't go digging up your backyard looking for wells this morning. But you just might find that a well, figuratively speaking, a blessing from God that is yet another sign or symbol to you that God's faithful. He's going to see you through in whatever way He chooses. So let's be obedient. Let's live out that obedience of faith so that we might receive the blessing of the Lord and be a testimony to the world. Let's pray.